Hi, 8th graders, it's Miss Dodd. Today we're going to do a final review of everything we've learned so far in early colonial history, especially of New Orleans. Hopefully this isn't boring. I'm going to try not to bore you to tears. I remember when I was in school, history class was like, put me to sleep. So I'm going to try and make this as interesting as possible right before we go on break. Woo! Okay. So follow along with me in your packet. If you look, I have here, take information highlighted in red, and I want you to write it in each box as I go through the slides. That way you'll have all the essential information you need for your benchmark. All right. Okay, so here's our history review. We have talked about so many different things. The Native Americans in Louisiana. We did a research project on different Native Americans that lived in Louisiana before the Europeans came and settled. Some of the major groups were the Caddo, the Chickasaw, and the Natchez Indians. Oops. Here's a picture of two Caddo Indians from the 19th century. The main point here, and something we haven't really discussed in class, but an interesting fact about Native Americans in Louisiana, something you can tell your parents at the dinner table tonight, is that there's a group of Indians called the Poverty Point Indians who are in northeastern Louisiana. They were mound builders, so they built these big mounds, and no one really knows what they were for. Here is a picture of the mounds. There's one mound. The Dunbar Mound. We have a Fred Dunbar in the 8th grade. That's devoted to him. So nobody knows what the Poverty Point Indian mounds were for, but it was very interesting that from their society that they built these mounds. All right, so the Native Americans' lives were disrupted by the arrival of the Europeans. This Spaniard, Hernando de Soto, came in the 1500s looking for gold and silver. The Spanish were very greedy. He had saw what the conquistadors did in South America, and he wanted to find gold in the U.S. He was the first European to see the Mississippi. Remember, he took that wandering path all through southeastern America. Didn't really know where he was going. And he killed thousands of Native Americans with guns, because he brought his own guns, and then germs. He brought in a bunch of pathogens and germs from Europeans that the Native Americans were not used to, and they died. One thing, on an interesting side note, De Soto was buried in the Mississippi River. He and his men had told all of the Native Americans in Louisiana that he was a god, and so they buried him there because they didn't want them to riot. If they had found out that their god had actually died and wasn't in fact immortal, it would have been a big issue. All right. Then we learned about La Salle, who came in the 1600s. This was a Frenchman. I want you to write all of these three things down there. This is very important about La Salle. He was looking for trade routes. Remember, the French were into fish and furs. He claimed the Mississippi River for France. He sailed all down the Mississippi and said, this is France. And he named France here. Don't copy that. He named Louisiana after King Louis, Louisiana the 14th. Here's a picture of La Salle. Pretty good mustache. I don't know. He looks like a handsome guy. I'd date him. Okay. Then we get to the 1720s, the Iberville brothers. Now remember, Bienville and Iberville. Iberville was the older brother. He was the one looking for a good spot for the New France colony. King Louis loved Louisiana. We need to get the Gulf of Mexico. We need to secure it. This is a great point for trade routes. It's also protected from the British and the Spanish. Let's get this. So they were looking around for a capital. Iberville went and tried to found one in Mobile and then Biloxi, but then Bienville, his younger brother, founded New Orleans as the capital of the colony of New France. So that is why we call Bienville the founder of New Orleans. So he and his brother, Iberville, founded New Orleans. Here is the early map of New Orleans. It looks very different than what it looks like today. All of this around was marshy land. It wasn't very good for farming. And then this was the very square French Quarter they built right upon the river. The reason why they built it there is because that's the highest ground. The closer you get to the river, the higher the ground is. The farther away you get from the river in New Orleans, the lower, marshier, swampier the ground is. Bienville wasn't too smart about building his city right here in New Orleans because it was so swampy that even the Native Americans weren't really growing crops here. So that was kind of a bad sign. If people had been living there for thousands of years, decided not to grow stuff there, you knew it wasn't probably a good place to start all of this agricultural cash crops. It also wasn't a great place because even though it was sort of protected and buffered by the wetlands that were there and also by the fact that there was that big bend in the river, which is why we call New Orleans the Crescent City, it flooded every single year for the first 4 years until they started building levees. So 1718, 1719, 1720, 1721, the river kept flooding. It wasn't a great idea. Bienville. Okay. Bienville started shipping over slaves from Africa almost immediately. They tried to enslave Indians. The Indians kept going back to where they came from. So Bienville said, let's get Africans where they can't run away. We'll put them on ships. And it was a very horrible, traumatic thing that he did. He created something called the Code Noir. Noir means black in French, so it's the black code, or the code that regulated Africans. Write all of this down. They needed the slaves for their agricultural economy. They were growing tobacco and indigo, which is a type of blue dye people would use to dye their clothing. And Bienville regulated the lives of slaves and freedmen through the Code Noir. Here's a picture of slaves harvesting one of their other cash crops that started up in New Orleans, which is sugar cane and sugar refining. We're going to talk a little more about that later, but keep that in the back of your mind that sugar is a very important crop for New Orleans during this time period. Okay, finally, the colony struggled a little bit under Bienville. It didn't do very well economically. It was one disaster after another, especially with those floods. And so we started having all of these conflicts between the French and Indians who were fighting together against the British in the 1750s. So what happened, the major thing you need to know is France gave Louisiana and New Orleans to Spain after the war. I'm actually going to turn that red as well. I want you to write that down. That's the main change that happened. And remember that it wasn't too traumatic of a change because the Spanish and French were both Catholic, but they didn't like the governor Ulloa very, very much when he came in. And a lot of the people, the residents of the French Quarter, rebelled. All right, I know I packed in a lot of the history. As you can see, we have learned so much over the past 2 weeks. So finish taking your notes and then complete your exit ticket. I hope everyone has a wonderful, restful October break. I will miss you all, but make sure that you are brushing up on your history. There's history all around us, and come back to school with a cool fact you learned about social studies. Bye.